The Emperor of Mankind is the sovereign of the Imperium of Man, and father, guardian, and god of the human race. He has sat immobile within the Golden Throne of Terra for 10,000 years. Although once a living man, his shattered body can no longer support life, and remains intact only by a combination of ancient technology and the sheer force of his will, itself sustained by the soul sacrifice of countless millions of psykers. His will is omnipotent, extending across the million worlds that comprise his Imperium. For 10,000 years the Master of Mankind has served humanity, simultaneously carrying out a multitude of tasks vital to its survival. All at once he guides his race through the Emperor's tarot, soulbind psykers, holds audiences with his most important servants and directs the Astronomicon beacon that guides space vessels through the warp. His immense psychic powers constantly keep the Chaos Gods in the warp at bay, preventing their intrusion into the material universe and protecting his people throughout the galaxy. The Emperor's role as guardian of mankind seems to have been predestined for him. Without the Emperor there would be no Imperium, little space travel, and no protection from the multitude of threats facing mankind. The Emperor knows that to protect his race he must survive as long as necessary for the emerging race of psychic humans to evolve sufficiently. In the millennia since his ascension to the Golden Throne, the Emperor has become a god to his people, the worship of him uniting humanity throughout his Imperium, superstition and dogma replacing his doctrine of imperial truth. Demonkind refers to the Emperor as the anathema. Origins of the Emperor. Little is known about the majority of the Emperor's life, of who he was and what he did before he emerged as the great Emperor of mankind. Only the Emperor himself remembers. A few pieces of information have come to light, from various different sources, and present some small parts of a coherent whole. However, their reliability is often disputed, especially as the Emperor's tale changes somewhat with each retelling. It is said that the Emperor's birth, while a natural process, was actually the result of a scheme created by the wisest and most powerful of living humans at that time, the conclave of shamans. These men, termed shamans by their society, were powerful psykers with great experience of the warp. Finding their souls, and those of humanity, endangered by the growing perils of the warp gods, these psykers decided to pool their power into one human, a being they called the New Man. Already having gained the power to reincarnate themselves, upon death, the shaman's souls would transfer to the warp, accumulating power enough to reincarnate as human. The shamans entered a suicide pact. Thousands of them poisoned themselves and sped their souls to the warp at the same time. Presumably pooling their soul energy and using their reincarnation ability, they brought about the birth of their new man, the Emperor, 1 year later. This same source states that the Emperor was born to mortal parents on Terra in the 8th millennium BC in a primitive Proto-Hittite village along the banks of the Sakarya River, in Anatolia, manifesting his powers as a youth. While a young adolescent, the Emperor's father was murdered by his uncle. While preparing his father's body for a primitive funeral ritual, he received a vision of his murder. Later, the boy who would become the Emperor calmly approached his uncle and stopped his heart with his psychic abilities, displaying neither sorrow nor malice. According to the Emperor himself, this was the moment he realized that humanity needed law, order, and the guidance of a ruler. Shortly after, he left his village for the first city of humanity, likely ancient Sumeria. Sometime later the perpetual Urda met the Emperor, already a warlord attempting to accelerate human evolution and guide the race into a superior species. Urda became one of the Emperor's followers as he attempted to seek out and recruit every perpetual on Earth to his cause. During this ancient time, the Emperor was known as Neoph. At some point before recorded history, the Emperor became a king and organized his own armies with the perpetual that will become known as Elanius Person as his war master. Seeking to protect and guide humanity, the two friends besieged a tower in East Phoenicia built by the cult that will become known as the Cogniti. After their forces succeeded in capturing the tower, they discovered it covered in enuncia and bleeding in the corruption power of the warp. Alanius demanded the tower destroyed, while the Emperor wished to preserve the knowledge it held within in order to better protect against chaos in the future. Disillusioned with the Emperor, Alanius stabbed his king with a dagger and then uttered a line of enuncia to destroy the tower and escape. The immortal being who would become known as the Emperor proceeded to haunt the history of humanity as a ghost, watching, waiting, and occasionally influencing. Living secretly amongst mankind, he developed his abilities until his psychic might allowed him to gain knowledge of not only his own world, but of the dangers beyond it. Aware then of the vast predations awaiting humanity, the being that would become known as the Emperor resolved to guide and protect humanity. Eventually, over 10,000 years before his current circumstances, he took his struggle out into the open, primarily because of the ever-increasing number of psykers, whose very existence endangered their species. During the Dark Age of technology, Olivia Sirica traveled with a man who would become the Emperor to the planet Molech, where there was a gateway into the realm of chaos. The Emperor entered the gateway, and there made a bargain with the Dark Gods and emerged wielding a measure of their power, including the ability to create the Primarchs. However, for some reason, the Emperor did not keep his end of the bargain to spread chaos to humanity, and he became the anathema of ruinous powers. The Emperor was able to clone the energies he was imbued with, giving them to his Primarchs after combining his own genetic material with that of Erders. At some point in Earth's history, the Emperor discovered an ancient device beneath the ruins of Asia's deserts and became determined to completely cut off humanity from the malignant influence of the warp. The first step of this grand project was to substitute warp travel with the webway, and the final phase would see the Emperor shepherd humanity's evolution into a truly psychic race independent of chaos, ascending to a level not even the Eldar were able to. This grand ambition was to guide all of the Emperor's undertakings and would be the culmination of his planning. Rise of the Emperor. The man who would later become known as the Emperor first appeared openly as one of the many warlords struggling for control of Terra during the latter part of the Age of Strife. He was at this point just another Terran warlord, but he met Malcador, who convinced him to take the title of Emperor. He was once known as the Master of the Lines in a mountainous region of Terra. There, he would seek out individuals whose genetics he could use in his Thunder Warrior project, as well as offer services of gene editing the offspring children in the region to correct genetic mutations. It was during this time he met Amar Astarte, who he and Erda worked closely with on the Prime Arc project. He also met Ezekiel Sedain, who would later develop the Black Carapace for the successors of the Thunder Warriors, the Legio Astartes. The Emperor undertook a series of campaigns against all the other warlords on the planet that would later become termed as the Unification Wars. During these wars, the Emperor employed several military formations, such as the Thunder Warriors and Geno 52 Kiliath, that consisted of genetically altered, engineered warriors, who played a significant role in his eventual victory. With this victory, the planet and population of Terra were at last unified under one rule, that of the Emperor. With this achievement behind him, the Emperor then set in motion his plans to take his purpose of uniting and guarding mankind out into the stars, to unify with the bastions of humanity scattered across the galaxy. This undertaking would become known as the Great Crusade. The prospect of the Great Crusade and the bitter fate of the Primarchs horrified Erda, who viewed the creations as her sons. The Emperor prepared extensively for the Great Crusade. He created the special Astro-Telepath Core to link his eventual dominion together, and caused the creation of the Astronomicon, a supremely powerful signal device powered by the Emperor's own psychic might that would allow simplified and safer travel through the warp. Chief amongst his designs, however, were the creation of superhuman warriors, the logical extension of the gene troopers already under his command. He had first undertaken the Prime Arc project, the creation of 20 infants from his own genetic code, designed to mature into powerful generals for his armies. However, this plan went awry with the intervention of the Chaos Powers. Other sources state that the Emperor's longtime colleague and fellow Perpetual, Erda, cast the Primarchs into the warp to deny the Emperor his plans for them. While accounts vary as to exactly what happened, the end of the tale is always the same: the Primarchs were cast into the warp and thought lost. During the tumultuous event, the Emperor's gene lab was devastated by the forces that scattered the Primarchs. He held up the collapsing underground roof with his psychic power until the vault's workers and data could be safely evacuated. Afterwards, Malcador and Constantine Valda believed the Primarchs dead or corrupted. However, the Emperor sensed their echoes in the warp and knew they were still alive. Malcador was surprised that the Emperor began to refer to the lost Primarchs as his sons, something Valda saw as an ebb in his attempts to suppress his human emotions. In the aftermath of these events, the Emperor evolved a new plan. Using genetic material which had been derived from the Primarchs, he created a caste of warriors which would possess some of the qualities of the Primarchs. These successors to the genetically altered warriors of the Unification era were the Legions Astartes, the Space Marines of the first founding. After purging the Thunder Warriors and replacing them with these more efficient warriors, the Emperor led the Space Marines into the reconquest of the Sol system. He drove Xenos enslavers from the moons of Saturn and Jupiter and, most importantly, achieved peace and eventual integration with the Mechanicum of Mars. This alliance provided the Emperor with much of the means and material to extend his crusade into the stars. With the final abatement of the warp storms began the Great Crusade. The Emperor's forces rediscovered human worlds, cast out alien oppressors, and claimed new territory aplenty. Perhaps most importantly, the Emperor, leading his crusade, rediscovered his lost sons, the Primarchs. Scattered throughout space, the infants were found one by one over a period of many decades, and reunited with their father and their kin. All were placed in command of the legions created from their respective gene seed and played their part in forging their father's Imperium. First amongst the Primarchs was Horus, said to be first discovered and first honored. However, a contradictory and dubious account given by Alfaria states that he was the first recovered by the Emperor, being found directly on Terra itself. Whatever the truth of Horus' order of discovery, the two fought together at the forefront of the early Great Crusade. The Emperor protected Horus during the Siege of Raylis, while Horus repaid the favor during the Battle of Goro. During the Battle of Gyros Thravian, the Emperor slew the mighty orc warboss Garkle Blackfang after it had held off 3 of his Primarchs. Some 200 years into the Great Crusade, the Emperor decided to return to Terra and placed Horus in charge of the military advancement of his Imperium in his stead. Granting him the title of War Master after the Alanor Crusade, the Emperor declared that the time had come for his sons to show him what great leaders they were. Turning his back on direct military interventions, the Emperor then created the Council of Terra, the Imperial Tithe, and expanded the civil governing bodies of the Imperium, before retiring in seclusion beneath the Imperial Palace to begin work upon his greatest ambition, the Webway project. At some point, the Emperor left the palace to decree the Edict of Nicaea, forbidding the use of librarians within the Astartes legions. The Horus Heresy. This turn of events did not please all of the Emperor's subjects, several of his sons in particular. In the final stages of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's most trusted son, Horus, succumbed to chaos temptation. Horus was told that the reason the Emperor had left the Great Crusade was so he could attempt to reach godhood, abandon all his sons, and betray one of the central tenets of the Great Crusade, that being, to enlighten humanity and free it from the bonds of false gods. Horus saw it as his duty to save the Imperium and turned on his father. Having corrupted fully half of the Space Marine legions, Horus led them against the Emperor and plunged the fledgling Galactic Empire into a colossal civil war. This became the most terrible conflict in human history, and billions perished as the traitor legions tore apart the empire they had helped to forge. The Emperor's son, Magnus, attempted to warn his father of the coming slaughter, but his telepathic message breached the Emperor's psychic wardings at the Imperial Palace and caused a grievous malfunction in the Golden Throne. Distraught, the Emperor ignored Magnus' warning and banished his son from his sight. The Emperor then dispatched the Space Wolves under Leman Russ to bring back Magnus before him in chains. However, the now corrupted Horus intercepted the Emperor's order and changed it, instead ordering the Thousand Sons destroyed. For the rest of the heresy, the Emperor was forced to deal with the Golden Throne's malfunction, which created a warp breach in the depths of the Imperial Palace. As demons flooded through the breach, the Custodian Guard and Sisters of Silence held them at bay while the Emperor punishingly exerted himself on the Golden Throne to prevent all of Terra itself from being swallowed. With his attentions turned to this crisis, the Emperor left management of Horus Rebellion to Malcador and Rogel Doran. During this sad state of affairs, the Emperor engaged in telepathic communications with a lowly astropath, Kaizu Lane, who had been given a vision of the heresy's conclusion. During their psychic communiques, the Emperor revealed he not only already knew his ultimate fate, but had accepted it. Later, Korax, distraught over the disaster on Istvan V, arrived at the Emperor's palace and demanded audience with the Emperor. Diverting some of his attention to the strenuous task of maintaining the Golden Throne, the Emperor psychically imbued part of the secrets of creating Astartes into his son's mind. Thus, Korax was able to begin rebuilding the Raven Guard. After 5 years of maintaining the stability of Magnus' webway breach on the Golden Throne, the Emperor began to exhibit physical fatigue. He finally began to show signs of exhaustion and his nose would bleed, even in the telepathic visions he sent to his custodian tribune Rarindimian. After sensing the birth of the powerful demon Dracnion in the warp, the Emperor knew the war in the webway was reaching its climax and the fate of mankind would soon be decided. He ordered the Sisters of Silence to gather 1,000 psykers across the galaxy and sacrifice them to the Golden Throne. This allowed the throne to be powered for a single day without the Emperor's presence, and he used that time to plunge into the webway and rescue the retreating Imperial forces. After sweeping aside the demonic hordes, he confronted Dracnion and sealed it into the body of Rarindimian, telling him to run as far as he could into the depths of the webway in order to keep humanity safe from its influence. Afterwards, the Emperor was forced to seal the webway portal on Terra by again becoming a prisoner to the Golden Throne. The Emperor lamented that his great work was ruined and maintained that now that the webway project had failed, humanity was ultimately doomed. Horus would be defeated by his hands, but someone else would take his place. To the shock of his custodian Diocletian, the Emperor declared the Imperium ultimately doomed, be it in a year or 10,000, and for the first time admitted he did not know what to do. Shortly before the Siege of Terra, the Emperor appeared before the 9 chosen champions of Malcador's Knights-Errant. The Master of Mankind stated that while his original Space Marines were built to wage war in the material, these new chosen must build a new order to wage war against the immaterial. Their fight against Horus was over, but their mission to come would nonetheless be necessary for the survival of humanity. The Emperor revealed he was initially hesitant to fight against these forces directly, seeking instead to contain it. However, Malcador was eventually able to convince him that direct action was needed. After telling them of their role, the Emperor bid them farewell as Malcador's confidant Aelwinter created a portal to Titan. As Horus besieged the Sol system in the Materium, so did the ruinous powers assail the Imperium in the Immaterium. The Emperor alone held back the tides of the warp from the Sol system. During these struggles, he often took the form of a prehistoric, weary, old man in a fur coat huddled over a dying fire. As Horus finally arrived in the Sol system, he appeared to the Emperor as a feral wolf, goading the Emperor and declaring him a tyrant and liar. The Emperor refused to even respond to Horus in these exchanges, looking past him to instead announce his rejection of the ruinous powers and declaring their puppet as nothing. As the embers of his fire died, the shadows around him drew closer and closer. As Horus arrived directly over Terra, the fire finally died and Horus gloated that the only option left for his father was to run. In the early stages of the Siege of Terra, the Emperor was confined to the throne, maintaining a psychic barrier that kept diamonds from manifesting on Terra. The barrier was so strong that even the demon Primarchs were unable to penetrate it. The traitors were eventually able to overcome the barrier through a warp ritual involving the mass sacrifice of lives on Terra, though even then its remaining power kept the likes of Angron from being able to fly past the walls of the Imperial Palace. During the siege, the Emperor deliberately allowed Magnus the Red to infiltrate the Imperial Palace. Deep inside the Imperial dungeon, a projection of the Emperor, dubbed Revelation, confronted Magnus and his men in the Hall of Victories. Revelation led them to the throne room, where Magnus came before the Emperor on the Golden Throne. Determined to go through with his vow to slay his father, Magnus obliterated the projection of Revelation and powered up his staff to deliver a killing blow to the Emperor upon the Golden Throne. However, before he could carry through with the act, he was blocked by Vulcan as his 1,000 sons engaged in battle with Vulcan's Drakwood and Jarki's pack. The Emperor's eyes suddenly opened, and Magnus found himself floating through the ether with his father and witnessing the rise and fall of the galaxy's many empires. The Emperor showed Magnus a future where the Primarchs never turned against the Imperium and the last world in the galaxy was conquered in the name of mankind. In this future, Magnus sat upon the Golden Throne to power the Imperial Webway, but his soul was in perpetual bliss as it drifted in the Immaterium along the Emperor to discover the limits of cosmic knowledge. The Emperor stated that this future may yet happen, and Magnus could return to the Loyalist side at the head of a new legion being prepared for him. Together, the Emperor and Magnus would expel the traitors from Terra and undertake the Great Scouring. However, the price was steep, for the Emperor declared the 1,000 sons damned due to rampant flesh change. They could not follow Magnus back into the Emperor's embrace, and would need to be purged. This price was too much for Magnus to bear, and he again struck at the Emperor but found himself in battle with Vulcan, who eventually managed to chase the Crimson King from the throne room. The last act of Horus' rebellion was played out above Terra, as the Emperor led a desperate assault against Horus's flagship after the treacherous War Master deliberately lowered his void shields as an invitation for a final duel. Though the Emperor was a being of unfathomable psychic and physical might, Horus had become mighty indeed, bloated with the powers of all 4 Chaos Gods and gaining the Emperor's own powers on Molech. After a tragic battle, and though heartbroken at the loss of his favored son, the Emperor finally slew Horus, though the struggle left him close to death. In this state he was found by Rogel Doran. The dying Emperor dictated plans for the arcane life support machine that would sustain his remaining cells for over 10,000 years, and he was subsequently interred in this altered version of the Golden Throne. The Emperor's Transcendence. Enthroned within the life-sustaining Golden Throne, the Emperor's will has transcended his main body. The Emperor is now divorced from the day-to-day running of the Imperium. This is left to the Adeptus Terra who govern in his name. Now, his will is interpreted and executed by the High Lords of Terra, his worship is regulated by the Ecclesiarchy, his law enforced by the Adeptus Arbitus, his form guarded by the Adeptus Custodes, and his people protected from the horrors of the galaxy and from even themselves by the Inquisition. The Emperor is confined within the Golden Throne, a vast biomechanical machinery forming the Great Sanctum Imperialis, located deep within the continent-spanning complex on Terra known as the Imperial Palace. There the Emperor's physical form is sustained by carefully maintained machinery. Physically, the enthroned Emperor of mankind is a ravaged corpse. The last surviving cells in his shattered body are sustained by the Golden Throne, providing an anchor for the Emperor's spirit, which extends across the entire Imperium. The Emperor and the Golden Throne continue to function through the daily sacrifice of thousands of psykers. While his body is sustained, his will endures. His existence is said to be an unending torment, with his every thought enslaved to the task of ruling, guiding, and protecting his race. Ultimately, it is only his will to endure that allows him to survive, as he knows his death would lead to the destruction of the Imperium and leave mankind without the guidance it needs to survive. Only through his power can the Astronomicon beam its guiding light, allowing Imperial ships to navigate the warp in relative safety. The Emperor is not just a beacon for space travel, however, but is said to continue to guide humanity through his tarot, and through dreams and visions given to selected individuals. It is also popularly believed that he created the warp storm known as the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath during the Age of Apostasy, and that the Emperor's will holds chaos at bay. Were it not for his unceasing struggle, the chaos of the warp would flood the material realm with madness and horror, causing untold destruction. In addition, the Emperor's presence on the Golden Throne keeps the ruptured webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace in check. Should it again open, Terra would become flooded by demons. In addition to these already profound powers, the Emperor is capable of stopping time for undetermined lengths and guiding his servants through manipulation of his tarot and sheer influence. Shortly before his own death, Konrad Curze spoke to a corpse puppet of the Emperor he had created. Shockingly, the grotesque work of art began speaking back and shone with blinding light. The voice stated that Curze had acted as intended, and like all the Primarchs had been built for a specific purpose, but chaos had interfered with his plans in the end. At the same time, the voice scolded Curze for believing that fate was absolute and instead blamed the Primarch's own choices for what would soon befall him. The conversation sent Curze into a frenzy and he tore the corpse puppet to pieces, and it is unknown if this was a mere hallucination or indeed the actual voice of the Emperor. One of the few conversations between an imperial subject and the immobilized emperor occurred at the end of the 41st millennium. Following the Terran Crusade, the reborn Rupert Guilliman stood before the Golden Throne and communed with the emperor. The Primarch was disturbed by what had become of his father's mental state. He felt that the emperor had lost all pretenses of humanity and gave off an overwhelming sense of coldness. The emperor greeted Guilliman with interest, but as a creator would a long-lost tool, not as a father would with his son. Guilliman feared that the centuries of suffering had stripped away whatever warmth and humanity he once had. What exactly transpired in the throne room is unclear, with both Guilliman and Captain General Trajan Valoris having no memory of what exactly transpired. Apparently, during their conversation the emperor called Guilliman both a tool and his son, and the last hope to save mankind. He assaulted Guilliman's mind with an overload of information and dark truths of the galaxy before going silent once more. During the Plague Wars, the Emperor would seemingly intervene through a militant apostolic named Mathieu in order to both destroy a portion of the cauldron of Nurgle on Iax as well as resurrect Guilliman, who had been slain by Murterion via the disease known as the Godblight. Channeling his power through Guilliman, the Emperor unleashed a mighty blow through the Immaterium which damaged the Garden of Nurgle and the Plague God directly. Before dying, Mathieu came to believe that the Great Rift was now empowering the Emperor, who was close to reawakening. Guilliman seemed to believe the priest and began to dabble with Belisarius' call on ideas on how to bring back his father. Rebirth. Two theories have been put forward concerning the possible rebirth of the Emperor. Note that at worst these theories could be considered complete fabrication brought about by Tsientian cultists and the lies of chaos, as the Inquisition has decreed. The Star Child. A controversial belief amongst imperial scholars, the Star Child theory has two aspects. The first is that the Emperor's soul is currently forming as a new entity, the Star Child, in the warp and that he will be reborn, a theory not dissimilar to the belief surrounding the potential Eldar god Aeneid, and the second is that the Emperor had children. After the defeat of Horus, most of the Emperor's soul is said to have dispersed from his body, merging into the warp in much the same way as that of the shamans, so many millennia before. It is believed that the Emperor, while apparently designed and empowered by the shamans to live forever, also possesses their ability to reincarnate, and that this would be his eventual goal. Avoiding discovery by the Chaos powers, it is believed that the Emperor was able to plant the seed of his reincarnation, a potential new soul awaiting birth, the Star Child. However, it is also believed that this new soul cannot be born while the Emperor is still tied to the Golden Throne, no matter how tenuously. Along with this, the Emperor is said to have had children. Although a man of unparalleled and godlike powers, the Emperor was still a man, and throughout the many millennia of his life on Terra had fathered many children. A few of their descendants had inherited some of the Emperor's power, including agelessness, and survive into the age of the Imperium. They are known as Sensei. Sensei have a unique nature and relationship with the warp which makes them invisible to psychic senses, even to those of the Emperor. The ultimate goal of the Sensei is to attain apotheosis with the Star Child. The Sensei-Emperor. There is another possibility given for the Emperor's resurrection or rebirth. A hidden group that call themselves the Illuminati have learned from the Eldar's Black Library many truths of chaos, as well as about the Sensei and the fall of the Eldar. They realize the Emperor cannot survive in his current state forever, and eventually he will fail, and without the Emperor, mankind will fall to chaos like the Eldar. Such an event would create a fifth god of chaos and create another Eye of Terror, one which would span the entire Imperium. They seek to prevent this by bringing about the rebirth of the Emperor. This involves gathering together the Sensei, protecting them from the Inquisition, preparing them for what they claim is the final war with chaos. In truth, they ultimately plan to sacrifice the Sensei to the Emperor, in the same way so many psykers have been consumed by the Emperor. The Emperor will be renewed and reborn as the Sensei-Emperor to again lead his race in person. Thank you for listening to this entry from the Warhammer 40,000 Lexicanum.